Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience. It's a great pleasure to be with you. My name is Astrid Frohloff. I'm a TV moderator, journalist, and a consultant, and I'm looking forward very much to go into an in-depth discussion now about the future of Europe. After we discussed earlier about work and about data, we would like now to paint a bigger picture on the state of Europe, and we will discuss a very relevant question. How can we make Europe a role model for decarbonization, digitalization, and education, which are major trends, as we have heard earlier? So it's an honor and it's a privilege to discuss this with four of the top leaders of Europe's industries. I'd like to welcome them here at the studio in the ESMT in Berlin. We're happy to welcome Timotheus Höttges, CEO Deutsche Telekom AG. Nice to have you with us. We are welcoming again here at the panel Ola Källenius, Chair of the Board of Management Daimler AG. And we're glad that Martin Brudermüller is with us, CEO BASF SE, and also Carsten Spohr is joining us, CEO Lufthansa Group. So thank you very much to all of you for being with us. We will start our discussion, and you, dear audience, you're invited to put questions again by using the chat function if you would like to. So if we look at the state of Europe, we must admit it's not in its best shape. The unity is quite crumbling. Britain left the EU. Eastern Europe countries seem to go their own way. So I'm wondering, what relevance does Europe actually have for you as globally operating countries? And what are important European values in a globalized world? So if I address you, Mr. Källenius, first of all, from the automotive industry perspective, and to ask more precisely, in Germany for decades, we lived well on the strengths of being an inventor country and an engineer country. The brand of made in Germany was very valuable. So do you think these values are still of use to us today?
Yes, I do. Although I wouldn't necessarily use the term made in Germany, maybe invented in Germany or engineered in Germany or invented with German ingenuity. In terms of production, for decades and decades, the big companies are producing all around the world according to the same standards that we would use in Germany. But this engineering skill, this unique feeling for making top quality products, that is something that is still respected around the world. And our mission control for research and development is here in Germany. That doesn't mean that it should be an engineering effort on an island. Of course, we tap into talent around the world in the United States and China and India, Israel, literally everywhere. But we can be proud of our engineering heritage, and I don't see any of that hunger for innovation lost. On the contrary, European companies are investing massively into R&D.
Mr. Höttges, Germany is among the most competitive countries in the world. According to the World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, it ranks 5th out of 137 countries. So what do we need in order not to lose this advantage?
Look, on the one side, I think you're referring to a ranking which was made in 2018. And just looking back the last 12 months, what has happened in the digitization, you have seen the ecosystem of the US, emerging rapidly. You have seen Asia catching up in a lot of industries at that time. So I think, we should not rely on something which we had in the past. We should always look, how we keep our competitiveness in the future. And if you look in specific to over the last 12 months, the Corona crisis has showed the deficits which we have in our system. Look at the way on the digitization, for instance, of our governments. Look, the school systems, at least in Germany, they suffered big time of the digitization, and they are the prerequisite for being competitive in the future. Look about the amount of wealth which was created in the digital ecosystem outside of Europe. This is something which is challenging us big time, and therefore I think we have to wake up and we have to really trying not to rely on something which was in the past. So Look, Europe is, by the way, and I just refer to your first question, is probably the best place to live. I don't want to live in another place than Europe. It's the place of values, it's the place of democracy, it's the place of freedom, dignity of the individual. But I think, we have great world-class research. We have even, the vaccine was here invented, and we have great engineers here. But I think we have to learn that infrastructure has a value. That infrastructure is something which is the prerequisite for every economic growth which we have, especially in the digital ecosystem. Not only focusing on price, but even on the total amount which get invested. Digitization, software skills, something which is not in the DNA, at least not so much in the German engineering space. We have to catch up on this one and to create some independencies, digital sovereignty. Look, the cloud ecosystem is more or less outside of Europe. Public administration, I think our federal system in Europe and in Germany is too complex. To take decisions simply takes too long. And that is something where we need reforms soon, because the systems in China, for instance, they're working more autocratic on the one side, and they're more efficient, even economically at the other side. And then we have to overcome the national egoism here in Europe. I think that is the solidarity makes us strong. We are still the biggest market here in the world, and if we want to, let's say, play to this size, I think we have to be aligned. And therefore, getting over our national egoism is something which political leaders have to drive.
Mm-hmm. So if we take into consideration the pandemic and its impact, Mr. Spohr, how would you regard Germany as a business location? What advantages do you see, and where do we have to catch up?
Yeah, not only in order to save time, I must say I'd like to answer the question, what's a great place for business? Usually tends to be very congruent to having a great place to live. And I can therefore save time by agreeing with Tim Höttges. All of us travel a lot. Where else you want to live? There's surely a few nice suburbs in the US, and maybe there's even some nice spots in Asia. But let's be honest, in terms of a broad variety of diversity, the number one buzzword of modern times, where can you find that in the way you find it in 30 European countries? So I think some self-confidence as business leaders deriving from the fact what Tim just said, that this is probably the best place to live, at least for the broad part of the society, is part, I think, of creating the self-confidence which creates this great place to do business. Then obviously the wealth we have here in Europe and the way it's spread out, fairly equal, at least compared to other parts of the world, I think is a very good driver for business. And I fully agree with some of the deficits Tim was referring to, but they are more looking into the future. If you look at where we are today in terms of education and others, we're not that far behind yet, which is the reason why we are still we are the one largest economy in the world if you take the whole of Europe. So I think carry that self-confidence that the train has not left the station yet, and bring that into energy to work on those things which we have to work on, in my view, would be the better mindset than either laying back and just rest on history, or be frustrated because your internet is faster in Silicon Valley or in Shanghai than it maybe is in some parts of Germany. So I think that kind of a self-confident view into the future, based with those things which are nowadays so important: diversity, values. That where else do you find better values than the values which carry Europe? Even purpose, in my view, based on our history, reunification of this continent, are very modern values and goals and targets we should share here. Put on top of that the self-confidence that we have got it right fairly well the last decades, and use that energy going forward. That I think will make us a better place to live, and even more, maybe a better place to do business compared to where we are today.
Mm-hmm. Well, it seems there is a common sense about the values we have in Europe. But Mr. Brudermüller, we also know that we need a lot of innovations, a lot of investments in order to get Europe ready for the future. So in which fields would you say do we need investments and innovations mainly?
I mean, first of all, building on what the colleague said, I mean, we should not forget that we are a continent of innovators. And I think today's wealth has also built in the past for the right investments and the right innovations and technologies. And I think we are now living at a time where a lot of new technologies break through. And this is on one hand a huge chance to begin a race and to win a race in terms of technology development, but it is also a risk because when you start new technologies, you have also competitors who have the same intention as you. And I think we're all looking to the US, which is a very vital competitor, always has been in the past, and there's a new one like China. So what I think what is really important, first of all, that the industrial ecosystem and also the value chains are functioning. And I mean, if I talk for my industry, which is a research intensive one, which is an industry that stands at the beginning of many value chains, then I look to Carsten. We just had our shark skin technology. So we put a special skin on the airplanes and we fly with less fuels. So if I look to Källenius for the new cars, he knows how to build cars, but he needs also a battery that is very strong, and then the battery is a chemical reactor. So I could name a lot of these technologies that are coming, and just maybe to mention a few, it is on one end very clearly zero emission technologies that caters into the climate protection of Paris, totally new technologies that are electrifying. Then we have also all the green and industrial biotechnology, which I think has a kind of a renaissance and will be more important than ever before. When you think about getting away from fossil resources, also there plays genome editing. And then one I think is will be a breakthrough thing is the high performance in quantum computing, because that will allow us to solve problems which simply have not been possible capacity wise. And for my industry, it is definitely catalysis and material science. And I think in all of these areas, Europe is not badly positioned. So if we have the guts, if we have the self-confidence, and let's say if we get the ducks in a row, I think we can also win that race too.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're glad that you're so positive about this. Let's focus a bit on one topic which Mr. Källenius mentioned earlier, and which is a huge challenge on a global scale: decarbonization. We know that the EU had set up a very ambitious goal, and mobility plays an important role for the Green Deal. So, Mr. Källenius, how can Europe become a role model for sustainable mobility, and how can the automotive industry contribute to this?
One way or another, decarbonization is going to affect every business. Of course, it's very prominent in the discussion around mobility because our invention is based upon the combustion engine, which is fueled by fossil fuels. So we are going through nothing less than a complete transformation, or you could say disruption. And we have to replace ultimately the energy source for mobility. And I see three things that have to come together to make this happen. On the one hand is what the auto industry is doing. We have to produce a new product. We have to reinvent the invention. We're doing that. We need a comprehensive infrastructure everywhere. For cars, it seems like it will be quite obvious that it's the electric car that is going to take over gradually during this decade and into the next decade. So a charging infrastructure everywhere to safeguard the individual freedom and the mobility. But the third thing is the energy source. It all really doesn't make sense unless we then replace fossil fuels with an energy source that is CO2 free. If Europe can make all those three things happen, we can be at the forefront of this. Clearly in Brussels, you see that there's a political will. Now we need to also create an industrial will and a framework that this can happen. In terms of the car industry and getting the product onto the road, I'm quite optimistic. If I look at the investments that's going on in the German auto industry or the European auto industry as a whole, everybody's going into it. Of course, we need you, Martin, and others to make this happen. So many players are involved in doing this. But this is now almost viewed upon as an engineering problem. It can be solved, but we get to get this synchronization between the three things right: the product, the infrastructure, and the energy source. And then we can be at the lead.
Mr. Brudermüller, what about the chemical industry? The chemical industry requires a high amount of energy on one hand, but on the other hand, it also plays a key role in supporting other companies in finding new solutions and reaching their CO2 goals. So could you outline a bit, what is your concrete strategy to save energy and help protecting the climate?
Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier, I mean, these three industries, cement and a chemical industry, as well as steel industry, these are the material suppliers for the value chains. And this is also the energy intensive industry. So, you know, from your chemistry lesson that there is thermodynamics and that there is a lot of energy change with conversion and chemical reaction. So we cannot get rid of the thermodynamics. That means we have to replace fossil-based fuels by electricity, and that can be only from renewables. So if you look for my industry, which is BASF as an example, 21 million tons of CO2 every year. If we want to get rid of that, and we have actually plans, and we know technically how we do that, it's an economic challenge, and it is definitely an investment challenge, but we would need about 4 times as much renewable energy. So we will go into this. You might have seen this sector coupling project, this RWE, which we just announced recently, where we want to build offshore wind parks together without subsidies, doing that with market economy, producing electrical energy at competitive prices, bring it to our sites, and then basically with the investments of new electrified processes really go for that. And what I can see, for example, and that builds on the previous question, I see in my company a huge wave of creativity to come now with new ideas how you can actually do chemistry. So that is really fascinating. So what we have then taken up is that we really made also as a management a huge commitment. We want to reduce our CO2 footprint by 25% with respect to the reference of 2018, which is heavy because we have already reduced 50% since 1990. But I think you have to make that call from the very top. It is, I think, a CEO call. I'm personally worried about the climate change, and I see the responsibility of our industry. So what we do now is we go in pilot facilities for the electrification in our sites, and we invest massively in partnering and just getting a huge amount of electricity from renewable sources. And my major concern, actually, whether we manage to achieve our targets, is not the power of BASF or other companies. It is actually that regulation, society, and the industry will create an environment where this is possible without losing the competitiveness on this way forward. If we manage that, a kind of a new way to collaborate with each other, I think we can do that, and I'm sure that BASF will achieve its targets.
Mr. Spohr, if we look at aviation and climate protection, Lufthansa went through a tough year. Now we have this discussion in Germany about a possible ban on domestic and short-haul flights in order to reduce emissions. France has done so already. So how can we combine ecological and economic needs in the future? How to combine these two goals?
Well, I'm happy to say that that discussion on banning short-range flights didn't last very much longer than one Sunday and one Sunday paper, because the reaction was so overwhelmingly negative from the media, from the population, even from the party who made this suggestion. I think we have a more rational discussion on this topic. France is obviously a wonderful example. They were magic in doing their PR, announcing canceling short-range flights. But then in the small print, it said, unless there are transfer passengers on board, and unless it takes more than 2.5 hours by train. That in the end left 3 routes which were canceled in France. If we would put that regulation to Germany, we even would only have to cancel 1 route, which is Düsseldorf, Stuttgart. All the other routes we fly in Germany either have transfer passengers on board or take more than 2.5 hours by train. So this French regulation, I wouldn't mind at all, but it shows how irrational and sometimes without substance this discussion is being taken care of. That is what worries me, because the answer to your second question is indeed a rational one, because technology will solve the challenge. There is no bypassing of flying. There is no alternative to having people and cultures and economies being connected by aviation, but it can then be with even less impact on the environment than the 2.5%, which we already have brought it down to if you look at global emissions. And that's technology of aircraft, by the way, the best being built in Europe, this continent we just discussed of being behind or not being behind. The best modern aircraft are built here. We eventually need to use sustainable fuels because there is no technical alternative to be seen in the next 20 years to actually have propulsion for aircraft. And then one day, and I wouldn't be surprised in Europe, somebody will invent a new propulsion system, which maybe even will allow us to fly without sustainable fuels with some other propulsion. But that's decades away. But there are solutions on the way. We just ordered 10 long-range aircraft in the middle of the crisis, and every one of them has 30% less CO2 than the ones they are replacing. So there's a lot to be done, but I think that is true for many of decarbonization projects. It needs to have the right regulatory environment, because we don't want to incentivize, in our case, those airlines who do the least for the environment to take the largest, biggest advantage from those airlines who do, like us in the middle of Europe. So I think this whole COVID discussion to be open, especially for us as corporate leaders, I think reopen the question, how much government influence do we need? How much regulatory influence do we need? I tend to say the next years will be more of years where government play a role. The next of global liberalization, government companies like us being supranational, overcoming government borders, I think is behind us. So I think it's also talking about modernizing Europe, a new phase of getting deeper involved with governments, not only to safeguard the climate, but also to make sure our continent plays the role it should play.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Höttges, let's talk about sustainability and telecommunication. We just learned that the first commercial quantum computer started his run, which is exciting. And Mr. Brudermüller mentioned earlier the relevance of quantum computing. But on the other hand, we know that quantum computing and also cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin are consuming incredible amounts of energy. Another side aspect is that home office, for instance, during the pandemic has led to more energy consumption. So the question is, how can we have both progress and innovation through digitalization and climate protection at the same time?
Let me say first, I was very surprised that one of our digital idols in the industry finally found out that blockchain and Bitcoin is energy consuming. So that was a big surprise for me. At least I know this already for 10 years. I not have the ambitions to be the Elon Musk of this world. But anyway, here we are. So look, it's true. Blockchain is energy consuming and Bitcoin by itself. But this is just one example. And I think there will be ways to even reduce the energy consumption in this field. That said, the productivity gain out of the blockchain is so significant that we all, get benefits on the other side as well. So it's not only the energy consumption. And I think this is the pattern we all have to understand and which we are all following. Now, take Deutsche Telekom as an example. We are always perceived as the good guys, the chemical guys here, Martin and Ola and Carsten. They are more the guys, who are consuming all this fuel. We are the ones who are helping to reduce it because the digitization is the way to enable home office, to reduce the mobility, to enable parking in a more efficient way. The intelligence is coming from the digital ecosystem. The data should not be stored singularly in one or the other. It should be handled by a cloud. The cloud is significantly more energy efficient. And by the way, it's creating even higher productivity for the industries. So the digitization is the key for the CO2 neutrality discussion and for the decarbonization of our society. And by the way, there's even some evidence around it. So what we know is that our networks help our customers to save 7 times more CO2 emission than emitted in 2030 by the technologies which we have. And therefore, I think it is not a contradiction. I think it is not the opposite. It is an adjacency. Digitization and climate protection, they come at the same point in time. And we have to be open for digitization. We have to open for the new technologies. This will help not only customers to experience the services, it will as well help us to be more efficient from a decarbonization perspective.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me mention an interesting study which is coming up now by the Werte Stiftung. The study is not published yet. It's about how major firms are dealing with the issue of sustainability. About 20 CEOs were interviewed, and among them 3 of you as well, Martin Brudermüller, Ola Källenius, Tim Höttges, and Lufthansa, Harry Hohmeister was answering the questions. So one interesting question was, and I would like to put it again to you, do you think sustainability will become more important than digitalization within the next years? Mr. Källenius, what do you think?
This is definitely not an either or. Here I have to agree with Tim wholeheartedly. It's one of the enablers for sustainability. So those 2 things are not in competition with each other. They are 2 trends that will help us solve problems.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Spohr, do you agree?
Well, absolutely. We need to save CO2s in aviation so we can invest them into streaming. It takes as much CO2 to fly to Frankfurt and back from Berlin as it takes to stream a movie for 2 hours. So we need to get better on that side to allow more for Tim.
Mm-hmm. There was another interesting question. Do you think that the social dimension of sustainability will gain more importance in the next years than climate and environment? Mr. Brudermüller.
Well, I think we should remember that sustainability normally has 3 legs. It's economy, it's ecology, and it's social. And I think what actually has happened a little bit also with the Green Deal now that we only talk about the green dimension, there are actually some forces in the population who actually think now this has to be potential green, but we should not forget that we can only invest and manage these challenges if we stay as companies economic. That means we have the means and the financial strengths to invest. And the other part is very clearly, if we don't take our people along and take the society along, it will also fail. For that reason, I think very clearly that this is a new kind of approach that we have to balance the 3 legs. If one of the legs is too weak, we will actually fail. And for that reason, I like it actually that we do not only talk about CO2 and sustainability, but that we also talk about the social dimension, because with all the challenges the society has, it will only work if it's in balance.
Mm-hmm. Before I will take some of the questions we received, I would like to talk a bit about digitalization and the role Europe plays globally. Mr. Höttges, I'm wondering if you as CEO Telekom would agree what German politician Sigmar Gabriel recently said. He warned that in the future, a hybrid world could emerge with a digital platform world dominated by the US on one side and a tech world dominated by China on the other side. So the question is, what's Europe's place in the world, and what is needed to develop a distinct European platform? Oh, right now we cannot hear you, Mr. Höttges. I'm sorry. Maybe. Are you muted? No. Let's see.
Hello?
Yeah, now we got you.
Okay. Sorry. So, I think, by the way, I'm not that dramatic. The digital ecosystem sits in America, the technical center in China. By the way, then people can come to Europe for making vacation because it's lovely to be here. Yeah, so let's invest in hotels. I'm kidding. So, but I think it will be a mixed world. And but what we clearly see over the last 5 to 10 years is that the US have developed an ecosystem for the digitization around the internet paradigm, about the data models, about the hyperscalers and the cloud platforms, about the AI and the analytics of all this data, which is superior to what has been developed in Europe. And in China, it's clearly that, you know, it is not anymore a production area. It is by far even a technology area, which is emerging with a lot of innovative, and by the way, great services, and even very affordable services. So therefore, Europe is challenged. There's no doubt about that one. On top of that, Europe is traditionally very regulated in every regard. Take the data protection law. Take our Schrems II legislation, which we currently discuss. Take the discussion about the telco markets, which are highly regulated in every regard. Every fixed line market is still regulated in Europe. Think about the development of high tech in our areas and the investments which didn't go into these areas. We have less unicorns, you know, in Germany than all the other countries you were talking about. So I agree we have to catch up on this issue. We need, I think, more competence in microchips. We need more competence on data and handling data in a kind of sovereign infrastructure. And what we need is even a kind of renaissance of infrastructure and digital services, which are not anymore regulated for price, but even, you know, incentivized for investments.
Well, big data, Mr. Källenius, is also revolutionizing the automotive industry. Connected cars are the future. So how do you see, you know, the difference between collecting data on one side, which is important for your business, and data protection on the other side, which is, especially in Germany, a huge issue. So how can Europe become a role model in this sense in regard to dealing with data?
Some people use the term data is the new oil. If you think about what that means, why was oil valuable? In our business, it was valuable because it could be used to propel a machine. And the use case was obvious. So if data creates value, you got to figure out, so to speak, what machine does it propel? And that means for us, you just have to put yourself in the shoes of the customer. So what can we do with the data to make our customers' lives better? That is the one question. That's maybe what some of those platform companies have done well, many of which are in the US, but quite a few companies in Europe are also using data. So that's what we're looking at. How do we improve safety, for instance? I mean, it's absolutely obvious that connected cars and eventually autonomous drive in a wider sense will lead to higher safety. But privacy is also important. It is very important in Germany, but I would say generally important in Europe and increasingly important in some other areas as well. And what the customer usually doesn't want to do is that you do things behind their back. And that's why we have chosen the policy that when we use data to improve their lives, we tell them what we're doing and we ask them for permission. I think it's quite a simple principle, and we don't try to hide it like it's sometimes done in a terms and conditions that is 100 pages long and you're too lazy to read it, so you just click. We make it a bit more transparent than most others to gain the consumer's trust, because the star stands for trust. And it's interesting to see the battle going on in the US, for instance, between Apple and Facebook and some of those, where you can see one company picking privacy as a USP, whereas non-privacy is the business model of the other company. It's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Spohr, what role data are playing in aviation? What's the future of flying? What innovations are lying ahead of us? And what are, in which fields of innovation is Europe especially very strong?
Maybe I start with the boring answer, which is that, of course, also digitalization and data optimization is optimizing the way we do our business. Behind the scenes, how do we operate? How do we make the business more efficient? The way we deal with our customers, the way you book, the interface to the company, to the airline. But I think more interesting, especially after this 15 months of COVID, there's limits of what data can do. As I always say, the one mega trend of our times is globalization. And globalization has flows of money, has flows of goods. It surely has flows of data, like this video conferencing we do now. But at the end, it leads to flow of people. if physical exchange of people, meetings, interaction is eventually not being driven forward, I think this world will be a different one and somewhat look like the world we now have been through for 15 months, we're also tired of. So I think with all intelligent use of data to either invent new businesses or to optimize existing business like ours or the one of Ola in Daimler, let's not forget that in the end, the data exchange cannot replace physical exchange. And I think that goes back to the beginning of the discussion as well. Values, where do you want to live? Does it matter where you live, or is it all remote in the future? I think these 15 months, as tiring as they were, also remind us that data cannot replace on digitalization many, many things we all cherish so much, and which is just coming back to us while we speak now in these days and weeks.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Brudermüller, how does digitalization support innovation in the chemical industry?
Well, our industry is also hugely data-driven. And maybe give you two examples. If you think about the Ludwigshafen site, which is almost 10 square kilometers with 200 plants that are all interlinked, you can imagine if you can systemize and generate a better data exchange, that you can optimize the whole system. This is, for example, why we want to install a 5G network at the Ludwigshafen site. The other example is actually all the lab data, because innovation is done by people and by lab experiments so far, and you collect this data, but you are limited with the human brain to actually draw all the value out of that. So what we started in this journey in 2018, we bought as BASF one of the first and largest supercomputers actually in the private industry. So it was at that time number 10, 1.75 petaflop. And we use now these supercomputers to do experiments in the computer before the chemist starts in the lab. And for example, you can feed that system over the weekend with 3 million theoretical chemical structures with a certain problem. And then on Monday morning, it tells you the best way to start your experiments in the lab is these 20 molecules. So that shortens the time, it makes it cheaper, and it can simply do things that a human brain cannot do. So that's also why I said at the beginning, the more power in the computer system you have, the better you can actually tackle chemical problems. This is why I'm so curious about the step from a normal computer to the digital one, because that will create problem solving, which we have never had before. And so it will accelerate innovation, and it will also create new ideas of innovation. So it's very, very crucial for the chemical industry.
Mm-hmm. So we got a lot of questions here, and I'll take some of them and hope that we'll find to answer some of them. One question is by Henry Sauermann from ESMT. He's asking, Europe is a great place to live, but EU companies seem too often to struggle to attract talent to drive innovation when competing with Silicon Valley and other places. So the question is, what can we do to build a stronger human capital base? Mr. Höttges, how do you see it from your point of view?
Still muted.
Still muted.
I think I'm not in control of this system. That is your operator who is doing it with me. But anyhow, look, there are always experts in this world which are a scarce resource and highly competitive, appreciated from all industries across the globe, like in AI, for instance. But in principle, I can tell you one thing, we don't have a problem on hiring talents at Deutsche Telekom. It has to do with the brand. It has to do with, let's say, the culture of the company. It has to do, let's say, with the prospect of the strategy. It has to do a lot of things with what people say about the company than rather what, let's say, big advertising is doing. This viral effect is helping us to attract a lot of great talents. So therefore, I don't see this as a big challenge. Maybe prospectively in some areas like software, where we're expanding, we have to go outside of Europe as well. We are in offshore and onshore markets already active. This is the global environment we are hiring. But for most of the jobs, I would not see this as a challenge for us.
Mm-hmm. There is another question which is about mindset and culture in firms. The question is, entrepreneurship is not only infrastructure, but also a mindset. Don't you think that our culture of, I'm quoting, the coffee machine is already washed half an hour before closing? Do you think that this culture can not only literally scare business and intellectual immigration in the country, but also inhibit innovation? How should we better deal with it? Mr. Källenius, what do you think about changing culture and mindset?
I think in general, many companies have a mindset of innovation. If you're referring to the working hours, maybe in Europe compared to what I've seen on my travels in Asia and so on, in some cultures, they work longer hours, but productivity is not work times time, it's work through time. So it really is crucial what you do in those hours that you do work, and thinking quite often for innovative engineers don't stop at the door of the company. So what's our role as a company? Give the engineers a really exciting and interesting problem to solve. Give them the tools to be able to solve it. Make sure that we have enough capital to be in the game, to be one of the most competitive companies in our business. And of course, create the culture of can-do and move the world, change the world and move the world. If you can put those things together, you will be a leading company in these high-tech industries. And in many or most of the industries where the German companies are active, you will find global leaders. So I don't think we have lost that touch, but we can't be complacent. We can't sit back. Let's just feed and nurture that.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Brudermüller, maybe you can take the next question. The question is, are we a continent of innovators? How are we so potent if the capitalization of the big 4 US IT company is much bigger than the DAX 30? Also, if we look at innovation, Europe lost advantage and China and the US are dominating. So how do you regard this?
So, I mean, I think if we look back, I mean, the resource our continent always had was smart people with good education. We never were strong in energy. We were never strong in raw materials. So I think actually everything Europe has been built was done by people and with the education. So I think this is something which we have to keep in mind going forward. What is also quite fascinating, if you look in scientific paper, Europe writes about 35% of the global scientific paper with a very small amount of people on the globe. So I think the problem we really have is not the innovation, it is actually the implementation, generating from an invention and innovation. That is, I think, where we are too slow, where we are too complicated. And I think this is also the strength, because you were referring to Silicon Valley, that is this very strong entrepreneurial courage, the risk-taking, to come from a scientifically new invention or a result to actually a product that generates later wealth and growth and jobs. So I think this is basically what is missing. And I have to say, we have been becoming complicated with this. We are over-regulated. And we have also the symptoms of wealth that some people just not, and also some, at least young people, do not want to take the risk. I mean, I think it is improving now with the startup culture. There's more of that coming up now in Europe and Germany, but it's still not enough. So, and that is what I said also earlier. We need a new kind of consensus and a new kind of spirit between society, between policy making, and also between the industry, if we manage this implementation and to get value out of invention. That is, I think, what really should be improved.
Mm-hmm. There is one question for you, Mr. Spohr. What means the innovation fail of the A380 for Lufthansa in compared to innovate companies like Lilium Jet?
Well, I think the 380 was a huge step for aviation in Europe, for the technical part of aviation in Europe, because the airplane was flown all over the world. So I think, and I cannot answer on behalf of Airbus, but they learned a lot. The 350, which probably is the best airplane in the world now, wouldn't be as good as it is if we hadn't gone through the learnings of the Airbus 380. So also there, Europe shouldn't talk itself down, should rather be proud of what it achieved there. And indeed, the aircraft stood for this. So we should not think, then the second part, sorry, the second part of the question was a little bit less negative. That was, say again?
Lilium.
Lilium, sorry, yeah, we don't take them that serious yet. I love the engineering element of it. We are suppliers of services to not only Lilium, but also to other players in that industry. There's quite a few companies out there in the world. So we actually talk to them about partnerships. They buy our products, they buy our services. But the answer to, you know, billions of people in the world trying to be living in a global village, visiting each other, will not be replaced by 4, 6, or 8 seaters. So we should always be proud of the innovation also in this part of aviation coming from Europe, but to put that next to a 380, I think is a little difficult. Where even with the Silicon Valley, I must say, this again comes back to the opening of our discussion. Let's not be too easily fascinated by things outside of our spectrum and always be less excited about things within the spectrum. I've lived in Silicon Valley. Surely a few people got very rich there. Surely few people have a wonderful life there. But I'd rather work in the middle management of a German company than work in the middle management of one of the tech giants in Silicon Valley. And I know what I'm talking about. So I think this looking across the fence, the grass is always greener, is part of our European problem. And I fear it's getting worse. I think the young generation students at ESMT need to play a role. Of course, we have a role to play to bring self-confidence, innovation, and energy also back to Europe to make sure we maintain in that wonderful, you know, position which we have achieved over the last decades.
There is a more technical question by journalist Stefanie Hornung, Personalmagazin. She asked, to what extent are you concerned with the so-called rebound effect? More efficient technologies do not necessarily lead to fewer CO2 emissions overall if more people use the technologies. Who would like to grab this question?
Well, I mean, at the end, it's a balance. I mean, I think we have to talk about behavior of everyone. It's not only an industry problem that BASF gets rid of its CO2 footprint. It is actually also the way of living. And I think it all starts with transparency. For example, we as BASF will publish at the end of the year for all 45,000 sales products, the CO2 footprint for each and every customer. And that will be a little bit of information like you have in the supermarket when you look at the label and you see the sugar content. And consumers choose actually maybe the lower sugar if they are health confident. So the same will be there with CO2 footprint. In future, you will have this information on consumer products, and then you have a choice actually. How much is my part I can contribute by changing a behavior? That not necessarily means I have to give up everything I like. I still can drive, but I can drive electric. So I think we have to bring this in balance. And at the very end, it's not black and white, but it has a lot to do with transparency and with choices actually. I'm strongly advocating for having choices because that is also what the fun in life is. I don't want to have politics who tell you what a good and a bad life is. So I think it is very much about transparency and then private choices.
Mm-hmm. There is another question about higher education, and the question is how much higher education how must higher education change to help Europe-based businesses better compete on global scale? So how can higher education be better and change to help Europe-based businesses? Mr. Höttges, do you have wishes? What do we need for the talents to be prepared for the future?
Look, I think the first one is that, you know, the curiosity is the one which should always, you know, drive your whole business life, and not just at the beginning. The curiosity is the most needed attitude, what you call higher education. You educate yourself. And it's not only academic education. It is the education about diversified teams, living in other cultures. It's the diversity about changing the function in which you're operating, which gives you a broader shape of skills. It is, and everything behind that is driven by your own curiosity. This is, I think, it's not your intellect. It's not, let's say, the academia. It's not the highest ranked business school which you have accomplished. It's about, let's say, that you always challenge yourself to challenge the status quo in which you're operating. I think this is what I think we need. And global leaders, global people who are running this global ecosystem, they need this diversified experience. And so therefore, I think, at least at the beginning, to always, leave the moment where you feel you are in a comfort zone. This are, I think, the better leaders, for the future. Academia helps. I think ESMT with its diversified culture is a fantastic greenhouse, but it's only a jigsaw, only a small portion of it.
Mm-hmm. There are more questions going in this direction. One question is, what kind of competences do you need for the future employees? What kind of subjects you think should be introduced in traditional bachelor or master programs at German universities? What skills do we need, Mr. Källenius?
Well, at a company like Daimler, of course, we hire people basically from all disciplines. If I look at our most urgent and practical needs here in Germany or in Europe is we need more people with software skills. And when I say software skills, I'm talking about coding, being able to write software. And that should gain more traction. We have great engineers, we have great business graduates. ESMT is, of course, a fantastic example of a master's degree where you combine both business and technology. We have great lawyers, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, we find software talent here, but if there's one area that I would put more emphasis on education, that's the one.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me grab one last question here from what the audience sent us. There's one question about decarbonization. It's a technical question. Christophe Leret wrote, some of your companies have decarbonization targets leading to 2050 for full carbon neutrality. It's way beyond the time you will be retired. Isn't it actually delegating a burning issue to our children, whether they wish it or not? Aren't there ways to fix more ambitious and accountable timelines?
Maybe that's going to me because our company, as energy intensive one, has committed to be net zero at 2050. I think, I said this earlier, I mean, we have a technology portfolio which we need to basically tackle all the CO2. There are some of the technologies mature, which you basically can apply today. And there are some technologies that are needing some more time for development. And there are some technologies that work, but are outrageously positioned when it comes to economics. And so you cannot apply them. So what is anyway not possible is that you do everything at the same time. You cannot do that also from the resources, also from the capital and whatever. So you have a long journey. The journey in my company is from now to 2050 to get down to net zero. So what I think is fair to say, if we want to achieve now a good contribution until 2030, we go for the no regret moves. We go for the ones where the technologies are ready and which make from an economical point of view sense. So the first mileage, I think this is important. We will have my predecessor, who's in charge of BASF in 2040, will have a totally different environment. There will be lots of innovation, new technologies. He will have other choices than I have today. We will have a different regulation. We will have a different attitude of people. We will have a different CO2 price. And he's then in charge, maybe for the last 5 miles of that journey. So I think what is important and what sometimes people don't think, our company is thinking in terms of 30 years. Because we are also a company that has capital circle, which is 5-6 years. So it's actually not so many investment circles until you reach in 2050. So for that reason, a long-term plan, a commitment now, and then you give over the baton to the next one who is actually transporting and making the strategy happen. So for that reason, there will be something left to solve for the next generations of CEOs. But I think this is good. They want to also be challenged and they want to make their contribution. So I think this can be tackled, and this is nothing new. because also in the past it was the same. Where we are today was actually a work of several generations to bring us over there and in an environment where we can enjoy our life today.
Mm-hmm. I would like to pick up something Mr. Källenius mentioned earlier in his speech. He underlined the meaning of cooperation. And Mr. Spohr, maybe you can explain what value does cooperation have for the future? Do we need more interdisciplinary thinking in general?
Well, absolutely. So I think, again, I'll start with Europe. One of the advantages of Europe, it's diversity, which is enabling us to cooperate, in my view, in a more creative way in many ways. So we need to keep that up. I think cooperation between the different disciplines is key. And I think the more the world develops towards a high-tech world, the more that becomes important. So when Ola said, what's Daimler looking for, they need people with software skills, surely I can underline that as well, but I will also add, Lufthansa needs people with soft skills. You can take the aware away, because this way of collaborating, I think in the end is driven by individuals, by people able to experience different cultures, people who have in a certain age in life experienced different cultures, cannot learn that probably with 55. So absolutely go for that cooperation element, but not only between various academic disciplines, but also, again, beyond cultures and maybe even beyond industries. So I can only, I think, encourage all these people who get their education now to make sure that's part of their CV.
Mm. So one last question I would put to you, Mr. Källenius, and I would like to come back to education. We are here at business school. Nelson Mandela once said, education is the most powerful weapon you can use to change the world. So if we look at universities and business schools as centers of high quality education and research, what role can they play, especially in the area of sustainability?
Education is the vaccine against ignorance. So we now have a vaccine against COVID, but education should be the thing that opens up our minds, that creates, I would say, a healthy debate about what the right solutions are. What Tim said, curiosity. It's not about learning a lot of things. I mean, you need to have know-how as well. But if you can learn critical thinking and inspire curiosity, then education has done its job, so to speak.
Well, in regard to the time, I'm afraid I must say thank you now to you. Thank you very much for sharing your views with us. It was a highly interesting talk. Thank you very much for being with us today. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you.
So, and you, dear audience, thank you for being with us. I hope you can take away a lot of inspiration, a lot of insights, how to successfully design the future. I'm looking forward to it. And I'm handing now over the mic to Jörg Rochel again for the closing remarks.